Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started, so order in the court, please. All rise. No. Thank you all for coming to our session on being explicit about implicit bias. I'm Mark Bennett. I'm a small-town country lawyer from Iowa, but I have a huge interest in implicit bias. I was the first federal judge in the country, indeed the first trial judge in the country to instruct juries on implicit bias. I've refined my instruction over the last 7 or 8 years. I've written several law review articles about implicit bias, and I'm currently engaged in 2 large national empirical studies of judges and lawyers about implicit bias, one in sentencing and one in the award of civil damages based on gender and implicit bias. But we have a wonderful panel with us, just incredible folks. So Roger Clegg is the President and General Counsel of the Center for Equal Opportunity, which is a conservative research and educational organization. Roger comes to us, all of the speakers come with tremendous practical experience. Roger held several prestigious positions in the Department of Justice, including an assistant to the Solicitor General. And as you know, the SG's office represents the interests of the United States before the Supreme Court. Roger argued 3 landmark cases before the Supreme Court. And he held 2 important high-level positions. He was the number 2 person in the Civil Rights Division and also the number 2 person in the Environmental Division. I take it not simultaneously. No. And he's a graduate of the Yale Law School, and he's very brave to show up on this panel with the rest of us, I'll tell you. Seated next to Roger is Professor Rachel Godsill. Rachel is the Eleanor Bonteque Professor of Law, and maybe she'll have time to tell you. It's an interesting story about why she chose that name for the prestigious endowed chair. She's also the co-director of the relatively new Perception Institute, which is an institute that brings together social scientists, cognitive psychologists, and law professors in a national consortium to look at issues about the intersection of social sciences and the law. She has great experience. She clerked on the Second Circuit, was in private practice, was an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of New York. Of New York. I wish she had been in the Southern District of Iowa. And she's a prolific scholar on implicit bias issues and other issues, and she's a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School. The full bios are in your material. Seated immediately next to me is Professor Elsong Richardson. She's currently a law professor at the very rapidly rising law school of the University of California at Irvine. Before that, we were fortunate enough to have her in Iowa at the University of Iowa for a few years, and before that she taught here at American University. She's got a very interesting background with a undergraduate degree in psychology from Harvard, and then she also graduated from the Yale Law School. And if I remember this correctly, both of you served for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
Together.
Together. Okay, great. And Song has published numerous articles. She tends to pick the minor law schools like Yale, Cornell, Minnesota, Southern Cal, and Northwestern to publish that. But we've got a great panelist, and I forgot to click. And then I'm going to start and give a little bit of an overview of implicit bias. And I've been looking for the last few years about one slide that would encapsulate virtually everything you need to know about implicit bias, and I finally found it in some odd places. And so the question is, which is the felon, and which one served time in a federal prison? So that's the end of our presentation. You can all go to lunch early now. So most of you would know the difference between explicit and implicit bias, but the case I like to use on explicit bias is I'm sure the law students will get to it. If you haven't studied already, is Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins, a 1989 employment discrimination situation. In that case, Ann Hopkins was the plaintiff, and she sued her company, Price Waterhouse, because she did not get a promotion, and her boss said she did not get a promotion to partnership, and her boss said that she needed to walk more femininely, talk more femininely, dress more femininely, and wear makeup and more jewelry. That would be a classic example of an explicit bias. But today, biases are much more often hidden or unstated. Social scientists refer to this as cognitive, automatic, or implicit bias, but it's nonetheless powerful. So here's just a little diagram I put together this morning. Shows you the difference. Explicit bias is conscious, intentional, and subject to logic. Implicit bias is unconscious, automatic, and logic is irrelevant. If you read the book by the Nobel Prize winner, Thinking Fast and Slow, that book talks about system 1 and system 2. Explicit bias is system 1, implicit bias is system 2. It's really interesting how implicit bias has really come to the national forefront. So just a couple of weeks ago in this very city, at the graduation at Howard University, this is what President Obama said. And we know that even the good cops with the best of intentions, including, by the way, African-American police officers, might have unconscious biases. And here's the important point, as we all do. I was a civil rights lawyer in my former life, and my mother died when I was very young. I was raised by an African-American nanny who was my second mother to me. I loved her. And when I started my own law firm, I started with my two best friends from law school. The fourth person we hired was an African-American assistant U.S. attorney, came to join our firm, to join our criminal defense practice. And 10 years after that, I swore him in as a state court judge. It was one of the highlights of my career. And about a decade ago, I've been teaching for 30 years an advanced employment discrimination litigation class. And the professor that I co-taught it with said, you ought to take an IAT. And I looked at him and I said, well, I'd take it if I knew what it was. What is it? He explained it to me. I went back and took it, and I took the race IAT, and I was absolutely shocked at the results. So I did what any good trial lawyer would do. I waited a couple days and took it again. And I was shocked at the results. So I did what any good trial lawyer would do. I proceeded to read everything I could because I had to convince myself that the test was invalid. And I read everything I could. Back then, there were several hundred articles, and I became absolutely convinced, at least by clear and convincing, probably beyond a reasonable doubt, that the IAT is a valid test. How many in the room have taken an IAT? Great. That's really awesome, because I've asked that question to 50 or 60 different audiences, and this is the highest percentage. So I wanted to just mention very briefly our blind spots. So this is a book that came out 2 years ago, and it happens to be by two of the three people who invented the implicit association test, Dr. Bennett at Harvard and Dr. Greenwald at the University of Washington. And it's a great, great read. But we all have blind spots. As a matter of fact, all vertebrates have whatever we are. You can tell I wasn't a science student. We all have blind spots, and we have a physical blind spot. It's actually at the intersection of the optic nerve in the end of the eye, and if you kind of move your hands this way, or you can take some tests online, you'll see that we all have blind spots. But we're not talking about blind spots in that sense. We're talking about blind spots in the sense that people recognize that other people are biased, but they have a very difficult time recognizing their own biases. And in fact, this was incredible. On Thursday, Justice Kennedy published an opinion in Williams versus Pennsylvania. Justice Kennedy is kind of the Supreme Court scholar on recusal motions. He did the original Likely case, and then Casperton a few years ago that dealt with the Massey Coal Company and the West Virginia Supreme Court. And then he wrote a recusal opinion in Williams versus Pennsylvania, where the prosecutor of a case got elevated to the Supreme Court and then Pennsylvania, and then sat in judgment on a case where he had authorized the death penalty. And so it's an interesting opinion, but this is what caught my attention. Justice Kennedy wrote, bias, and this was just last Thursday, bias is easy to attribute to others and difficult to discern in oneself. And that's really the classic definition of the blind spot bias, and it's really true with regard to implicit bias. So judges are overconfident about their ability to control their biases and asked to rate their ability to avoid racial prejudice in decision-making compared to other judges in the room. This was a study done by Jeff Roklinski at Cornell. 97% of the judges rated themselves in the top half. So we know from that 97% figure that it was state court judges, because if it was federal judges, it'd be 100%. And I've been conducting some empirical studies this year on this question, and except I raised it to the top 25%, asked to rate their ability instead of the top half to the top 25%, and 64% of lawyers all over the United States, from employment lawyers to criminal defense lawyers, rate themselves in the top quarter in terms of their ability to control bias. So to me, implicit bias is kind of an inconvenient truth for society. It's kind of like the flat earth and then Darwin's theory. It's kind of shocking when you first hear about it, but it's eventually come to pass that the science supports it. So just going to very briefly talk about Project Implicit, and then Professor Richardson Song is going to talk about how the IAT actually works. Project Implicit started at Yale. Now it's at Harvard, Virginia, and Washington. Took off with a grant in 2003. Over 6 million people have taken IATs, now averaging over 5,000 a week. For those of you who haven't been to Project Implicit, that's what the website looks like. One of the takeaway points from this is if you haven't taken an IAT, go back and just plug into your search engine of choice, implicit association test. They don't track your IP address, it's anonymous, and you'll find out a lot about yourself. I've taken about 30 different IATs, and it's really fascinating to learn about yourself. On the race IAT, over a decade from 2002 to 2012, over 2.3 million people have taken it. 86% were from the United States. I just want to talk a little bit about the development of attitudes and where the about 80 to 85% of Caucasians test moderate to high in terms of their implicit biases against blacks. So where does this come from? Dr. Banaji did a study, and she found that implicit biases are formed by the time we're 6 years old, and they remain constant through adulthood, unlike our explicit biases, which decline over time. Now, some of you may remember at least reading about Brown versus the Board of Education, and remember that was one of the first cases where a so-called Brandeis brief was filed, and Ken and Mamie Clark, African-American psychologists, I believe Ken Clark was the first African-American to get a degree from Columbia University in psychology, and they conducted a study called Racial Identification and Preference in Negro Children, and Thurgood Marshall cited that study in the Brandeis brief, and I'm going to show you a replication of that study that was just done within the last year, and it's shocking.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll?
That one.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because she's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
It's hard for me to watch that, and I've watched it so many times. So you wonder where implicit biases come from. They're developed so early in life. So just very briefly, we're going to do a real quick peek into the emerging science of neuroscience behind implicit bias. There are three main parts of the brain that affect implicit bias. I only have time to talk about the amygdala. So, yeah, let's go back to the fMRI. Anybody taken an fMRI? Anybody? Okay. Only one. How many have had MRIs? It's a young audience. Okay, most of us older folks have had MRIs. An fMRI is the same thing, except you're doing a test while you're in the MRI machine. So I recently participated in an fMRI study on crime and punishment at Vanderbilt. So I was in an MRI machine for about an hour and a half, and they flashed 60 different hypotheticals. My hands were Velcroed to 10 buttons, and I had to decide how serious the crime was and what the punishment should be. So it was very interesting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the amygdala. We each have two amygdalas, and the amygdala is the Latin word for almond shape, and the amygdala is our fear center. So unless you're totally fearless, you might not have an amygdala, and people who have had accidents sometimes have the amygdala removed. But most of us have amygdalas, and that's where we're fearful. And the first law review article I wrote about implicit bias, I started with a story of Jesse Jackson. And he was walking down the street in Chicago late at night, and he heard footsteps behind him. And he started getting nervous, and he heard young male voices, and he heard the footsteps getting closer and closer. And we know now that his amygdala was being activated. And this is what amygdala activation looks like on an fMRI. And when the young men were getting closer and closer to Jesse Jackson, he was becoming more and more fearful. And then he turned around, and he saw that they were white, not black, and he felt a sense of relief. Now, there are dozens of studies of fMRI and face recognition and amygdala activation. And they first started off with showing white faces to Caucasians and then black faces to Caucasians. White faces, there would be no amygdala activity. Black faces, there would be amygdala activity. So the initial research was just with whites. And then they did subsequent research with whites and blacks. And blacks have a amygdala response, not all blacks, but a fairly high percentage, to black faces. In other words, their fear center is activated. And so that was important because the amygdala is both the threat center of our brain and the novelty center. So there was a theory that novelty or lack of familiarity with blacks is why the amygdala was being activated so often in whites. But when blacks took it, they had the same type of amygdala activation, so that dispelled that theory, and the only theory left is you have amygdala activation for the same reason that those young black children pointed to the black dolls. You know, there are negative stereotypes about blacks. So there's a strong relationship between amygdala activity and implicit association test scores regarding race. And there's no correlation with express measures of bias, so I'm a good example. I have a great fondness for African Americans, always have had. I've taken a number of explicit tests, show no explicit bias. I'm thankful for that. But on the implicit association test, I still have a strong implicit association bias against African Americans. Same thing with skin tone. Dark-skinned faces generate more amygdala activity than light-skinned faces, and I think some of the panelists are going to talk about the effect of Afrocentric features on sentencing, because there have been a number of studies. And now I'm going to turn it over to Song, and if I can find what I did with my clicker.
You gave it to me.
What did I do with it? I am so absent-minded. Oh, here it is. Great. Okay, let me just click out of mine. But Song, why don't you just tell us how you got involved in the study of implicit bias?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. And for some of you who are in the back, there are actually a couple seats that I see up front and right there if you want to sit. If you don't, that's fine. I thought I'd let you know because I know I hate standing in the back. So My interest in implicit bias started actually at a conference that I attended where Jerry Kong, who's a law professor at UCLA, was speaking. And I was just starting my career as a law professor, and as Mark mentioned, in my practice, I had been a civil rights lawyer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and then spent the majority of my career before becoming a law professor as a public defender, both in state and federal court, and then in private practice. And so I knew that when I became a law professor, I wanted to focus my attention on issues of race, and specifically on the criminal justice system, and how race can manifest in discretionary decisions made in the criminal justice system. And it just happened that at the beginning of my career, I heard Jerry Kong talk about unconscious or implicit racial biases, and it just spoke to me. And so that's when I began to really study, and like Mark, read everything that I possibly could about the implicit association test and all the other ways in which our unconscious brains work, because it's not just about race. Our brains work in an unconscious way about everything, right? So that's why the science really spoke to me, because it just makes sense. This is how our brains work. For instance, I'm sure when every one of you came in today and decided that you were going to attend this panel and sit on what we all know is a chair, you didn't have to think about what that object was, right? You just knew what it was without any conscious thought at all. And that's what our brains do. I mean, we couldn't possibly function in the world if our brains just didn't do a lot of its processing in the background. And our unconscious biases are part of that unconscious processing that we do. So in order to understand the implicit association test and how it works, and again, I think it's important that it's only one measure of our unconscious mental processes. But to understand how the implicit association test actually works, I want to have all of you participate in a game with me. But before I do that, I also just want to say that the reason we have the implicit association test is because these biases are unconscious. And like Mark, I consider myself one of the most egalitarian people that exist, right? I mean, I just do. I'm a civil rights lawyer, I'm a woman, my father's African American, my mother's Korean. I mean, how could I possibly have any unconscious bias, right? I'm a civil rights lawyer. And so I too, after hearing Jerry Kang speak, I took the implicit association test, and like Mark, I kept taking it over and over and over because I couldn't believe, right, that I had unconscious attitudes pro-white, anti-black. I prefer light skin over dark skin. I prefer men over women, right? I took every kind of test you could possibly imagine, and I was appalled at myself, which is why I started to study this. I wanted to understand, how could someone like me have these biases? Okay, so I could ask people, right? I could go up to you and ask you, so do you have unconscious biases against women? Right? And the problem with that is, number one, you won't know it's unconscious, right? And even if you did, would you admit it? Probably not. Okay, so social psychologists have developed the implicit association test, and it measures how closely two concepts are associated in our unconscious minds. So what I want all of you to do next, and we'll do the first one together, is I want you to ignore the words that you're about to see, ignore the words, but shout out the colors. Ignore the words, shout out the colors, and you want to do this as quickly as possible while avoiding making mistakes. This is known as the Stroop test, right, for those who are psychologists here. Okay, so let's try this first one together. Ready? Red,
Yellow, blue, green, brown. Blue, brown, red, yellow, green.
Great.
Red, yellow, blue,
Faster.
green, brown. Blue, brown, red, yellow, green. Blue, red,
Okay, stop. happened? You were doing so well, right? And then all of a sudden, the color and the word didn't match, right? And so your reaction time, that's what is known as, your reaction time was slower because the color and the word, were not closely associated. That is the science behind the implicit association test. It tests our unconscious associations, how close our two concepts matched in our unconscious minds. So with the race IAT, and many of you have already taken them, but for some of you, if you haven't, I just want to explain how it works, right? So you sit in front of a computer screen, and you're going to be asked to sort positive and negative words and black and white faces using the computer keyboard. So you're going to use the E key and the I key on your computer keyboard. There are going to be some practice rounds, so it'll show a black face, and as quickly as possible, while avoiding making mistakes, you're going to hit in one round, let's say, the E key when you see a black face, the I key when you see a white face. When you see a positive word, you're going to hit the E key. When you see a negative word, you're going to hit the I key. Again, you're going to do this as quickly as possible while avoiding making mistakes. I'm going to do a few rounds right now. If you just want to do it in your, to yourself on your leg, right? So hit your left hand, your left finger on your left thigh if you see a positive word or a black face. That's your left hand. Positive word or a black face. Negative word or a white face, then hit your finger on your right thigh. Okay, so I'm just going to go quickly. Okay, so that was fast, right? I did it quickly.
Association of those words don't make sense to me in relation
To race,
yeah.
right? And so thank you for this question, right? Right, it doesn't make sense. So what this is trying to do, what this test is trying to do, and this slide will help us at least try to make sense of this, what this portion of the test did is what it put on your left hand were black faces and negative words, right? Words that bring up negative, I'm sorry, I just did it. Look what I just did, right? Without even thinking. What we did on this particular test is I put the black face and the positive words on the same hand. And what that is meant to test is how closely do we associate black faces with positive things, positive attitudes, versus on our right hand, even though you can't really see that it's a white face here, it was a white face associated with negative words, a stereotype inconsistent pairing. What all of the 2 million results that Mark indicated or talked about earlier demonstrate that for most individuals, regardless of our conscious racial attitudes, like me, most individuals have a harder time associating black faces with positive concepts. In other words, we have unconscious anti-black attitudes versus when we do the stereotype consistent pairing, when the black face and the negative words are on the same hand and the white face and the positive words are on the same hand, our reaction time is faster, just like when the color and the word matched. So that's how the implicit association test works. That is meant to be a measure of how closely we associate concepts in our unconscious minds. And the important thing, I think, for all of us to understand is there is no necessary relationship between our conscious values and our unconscious beliefs and attitudes. So I don't know if you want me to keep
Thank you,
talking
Son.
about other things.
And we're going to give the other panelists. Roger, would you like to weigh in on your general observations about implicit bias and any comments you might have on the IAT?
Sure. Thanks for letting me go first, and thanks to ACS for inviting me. I think it's important to have both sides here, and thank you also for that very nice introduction. I'm not sure the cases that I argued were actually landmark cases, but certainly my mother would agree.
And that's all that counts, really.
And what else really matters? That's right. You know, this is a very esteemed panel, and you know, my opponents are experts in this, and we are not going to resolve today, you know, the questions about the validity and the reliability and so forth of the IAT and all that. And it would be very boring if we tried to. I'm going to talk sort of generally about why I don't accept, you know, the IAT. But, you know, if you don't believe me, you know, you can go to Wikipedia, which, you know, who can argue with Wikipedia? Just, you know, type in implicit association test and go to Wikipedia, and you'll see that there's a lot of controversy, you know, about it. It's not accepted by everybody. A lot of people find all kinds of problems with it. Let me say, though, you know, just at the outset that I don't deny that unconscious bias can exist. I don't deny that conscious bias, you know, exists. So I'm not saying that these things are non-existent. I'm just taking issue with this way of measuring them. You know, basically, you know, you start off and there's this sort of technical reliability of the test. And, you know, the judge said that he's taken the test, you know, many times and implied that it came out the same way. That's not always true. And in fact, you know, the studies that I've looked at indicate that it doesn't, you know, there is not that consistency. I mean, to give you sort of a general example, or a general observation, you know, what social scientists look for a test to be reliable is a, you know, 0.7, you know, as the number, you know, between 0 and 1. The IAT is often 0.5 or lower. By comparison, the SAT is 0.9, you know, fairly consistently. So there's that sort of initial problem that it doesn't always, you know, it's not consistent in its results. But, you know, then there's the question of, well, is it really measuring bias? You know, what is it that's being measured? And, you know, I applaud, you know, Song for being very upfront and candid about how the IAT works. And I ask you, you know, doesn't this seem a little bit, I mean, if somebody, put the shoe on the other foot. Suppose that this kind of a test were being used by an employer. You know, where, you know, you're sitting there in front of the computer and these things are flashing there and it's measuring, you know, in milliseconds, you know, how quickly, you know, you associate this with that and all that. And hiring decisions were being made on how well, you know, people did on that. You know, I can tell you that if this had a disparate impact on the basis of race, people would be horrified. They'd say, "Why? What does this have to do with how well you can do your job? I mean, this looks like, you know, witchcraft. I mean, this isn't, you know, Darwinism and the Copernican revolution. You know, this is, you know, phrenology and astrology. And this just looks ridiculous. You know, to say that there's some correlation between how well people, you know, how quickly, you know, your fingers can work on a computer and whether you're a bigot. That's just crazy. And indeed, there are, you know, other explanations for, you know, why there may be these, you know, discrepancies in how, you know, quickly you click the button. You know, maybe, for example, and there are a lot of, you know, examples. You know, maybe what it shows consciousness of is not that you believe the stereotypes, but that that you're aware of them. Or, you know, maybe, you know, there's actually, you know, stereotype threat that, you know, if you're white, you know, you're afraid, you know, that, oh, you know, I don't want to be a bigot, and this, you know, influences, you know, how well you do on the test. I mean, all these things have been you know, discussed and looked at, and I think that there are real problems with just assuming that, you know, how quickly you press the mouse is going to, you know, translates into, you know, whether you actually are biased. Then there's the question of, well, all right, you know, even if it does, if there is some correlation with bias, you know, how strong is it? I mean, you know, maybe you're a little bit biased, but there's a difference between being a little bit biased and being really biased, particularly when you get to the next step, you know, of the analysis, which is to what extent does this actually translate into discriminatory behavior? And here again, there is a lot of disagreement on whether there is any correlation between the results on this test and whether people actually end up making decisions that discriminate against people on the basis of skin color. And then finally, thanks for letting me ramble on, but finally there's the question of, well, okay, even if there is a fair amount of unconscious bias out there, what do we do about it? And here again, I think that there's going to be disagreements between conservatives and liberals on what to do about it. I mean, I will fess up. My instinct is that a lot of this is sort of malleable social science evidence by liberals that is very convenient because it will enable them to advance their ideological agenda. And if there is in fact all this unconscious bias out there, that's a great argument for having racial preferences forever, and a great argument for getting rid of all kinds of other measures of a competence that happen to have a disparate impact on this or that basis. I don't like any of that. I hate the disparate impact approach to civil rights enforcement. I hate the use of racial preferences. But as I said at the outset, I don't deny that in some contexts there can be unconscious bias, and I'm all in favor of trying to come up with good ways to identify it, and where it's been properly identified to do something about it by sensitizing people to it and trying to make sure that it doesn't happen. But I suspect that the ways that I would go about it, I mean, one last example. Justice Ginsburg, when she wrote about this, and in the Walmart decision, said, gave us an example that, well, there was a lot of, implicit discrimination, implicit bias, against female musicians. So what orchestras started to do was to put, an opaque screen between the person who was auditioning and the people who were judging. And when they did that, it turned out that a lot more, women started getting hired. I think that's great. I am all in favor of that. I am all in favor of, if there is unconscious bias out there, of getting rid of the kinds of, the opportunity by removing identifying, characteristics, from people, who are applying for a job or something like, coming up with objective criteria. I have to say that, by and large, over the last decades, it's the left that doesn't like objective criteria. The last thing that the left wants to do is to get rid of SATs and things like that. The last thing that the left wants to do is to forbid people from considering race and ethnicity and sex in making college admissions decisions and hiring decisions and stuff like that. They're perfectly happy having all those things considered as long as it's done in a politically correct way and not a politically incorrect way. But go ahead and make a liar out of me. If we can come up with objective criteria, truly objective criteria that best predict how people will do a job or do in college, I'm all in favor of using that and removing the race and ethnicity and racial markers. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Rachel, I think you're chomping at the bit. And if I remember,
I am.
And I know Song is. And if I recall correctly, I think you wrote an amicus brief on behalf of social scientists in the Fisher case. Is that right? So you have Roger's given you a lot of information. So you respond any way you like.
Well, there are just so many points, and I'll actually start with a response to his last point and work my way backward. Which is the orchestra study, because there's actually an interesting little caveat to the orchestra study that perfectly illustrates the power of implicit bias. So Roger's right that there was a screen put in front of the people auditioning so that their gender would be obscured, because of course those who were hearing the music just thought, well, the men are clearly just better musicians. We can hear objectively, and they were looking forward to being proved wrong. Well, initially, when the screens were put up, there actually wasn't much of a difference in the number of women who were hired for orchestras, thus confirming the view of those who'd been listening to auditions for years that they were making objective decisions. But then someone noticed that for some of the people auditioning, before the music began to play, there was a click, click, click sound. The shoes. It wasn't until, and so did the people know consciously that the click, click, click had triggered a gender view? No, of course not. It wasn't until either some orchestras had people take off their shoes, others put a little rug. It wasn't until they prevented any sort of unconscious trigger of gender that the numbers of women hired for orchestras actually began to increase. And when that happened, they increased dramatically between 25 and 46%. So that's just an interesting little tidbit. So now I'll go backward, because I actually don't disagree, and I would think that Song and the judge are probably with me on this. I don't disagree with everything Roger said, just everything at the end. I don't disagree that the implicit association test, when people find themselves performing it and finding that they show a high to moderate degree of bias, means they're a bigot. I think that's a complete mischaracterization and a very unhelpful way of thinking about the implicit association test. And I don't know any social psychologist who would ever suggest that a single individual should be hired or not, or put on a jury or not, or allowed to be a teacher or not, based upon their implicit association test for precisely the reasons that Roger said. And actually, there's a terrific article that Brian Nozick recently wrote where he talks about one of the challenges Roger mentioned with the implicit association test, which is retest reliability. And he notes that it's between 0.5 and 0.6, consistent with Roger's point. But what he says is the implicit association test isn't useful as an individual diagnostic. It's useful because it's a large societal diagnostic, and that the small effect sizes that we see, when they're accumulated over time, show profound and powerful consequences. But of course, if all of this just ended, if all the proof ended with the IAT, I think, again, we actually all may be with Roger, but they don't. And so I'd just like to mention a few, and there's so many that I could spend the next 3 hours, which is what I usually get to do when I'm by myself doing a training or when Song and I are doing a training. I'd just like to mention a few that are interesting. So one is, and I'll just start with this one, one is actually a small study by consultants, and I'm very careful to note that, because consultants may have some interest, but it's been evaluated. The Nextions group sent 60 partners in law firms identical memos. Half of the partners thought that the person who wrote the memo was a white male associate named Tom Meyer, who went to NYU. And of course, those of you who work at law firms know you always get the bio with the picture, so that's how they knew it. They didn't have to like hit anyone over the head with it. It was just get the little picture. The other half thought it was a black associate named Tom Meyer who went to NYU, third-year associates. What's really fascinating about the study is that the Nextions people pull up some quotes that are really troubling. White Tom Meyer is a good writer, has lots of potential. Black Tom Meyer, mediocre at best, most troubling, can't believe he went to NYU. But arguably, I'll be with Roger on this, maybe those were cherry-picked, because you know how we on the left like to manipulate things. But what was not cherry-picked, and what's really salient here, is the authors of the study intentionally embedded 7 spelling and grammatical errors into the memo. And everyone here knows how seriously we lawyers take spelling and grammatical errors. We care about typos. The partners who thought that Tom Meyer was white found on average 2.8 of the 7 spelling and grammatical errors. The partners who thought Tom Meyer was black found twice as many, 5.8. Now, the fact that it's twice as many is obviously a little random, but for those of us who know the adage that you have to be twice as good to be considered equal, there's a certain kind of really distressing resonance about that. So that's a really interesting study. But here's another study, and here's a way in which, again, perhaps surprisingly, I may agree with Roger more than he thinks. A colleague I work with, Kent Harbour, sent intentionally badly written memos to middle school teachers and asked them to provide critical feedback on those memos. And they gave little pictures of the students, and so some of the teachers thought that the writers of these really awful memos, essays were black and Latino, and some thought they were white. The middle school teachers gave, in general, less critical feedback to the Black and Latino students than they did to the white students, and more generic praise. So this is this kind of racial anxiety, political correctness that Roger doesn't like, and frankly, I don't either. It's horrific. But what's really interesting about this study is that some group of the teachers actually did give the Black students the equal level of critical feedback. Those were the teachers who were in schools where they felt like their principals supported them. The teachers who were in schools where the principal supported them still gave less critical feedback to the Latino students. And so I guess what I'm going to do here is broaden our conversation a little bit. What this study shows is something that, again, Roger alluded to, but I reach a different conclusion. What this study suggests is two separate phenomena. With the Latino students, it's implicit bias. The teachers had some sense of what kind of writing capacities they had, probably based upon stereotypes about English, language learner assumptions. But with respect to the African American students, probably the teachers were falling into the trap that Roger described of not wanting to seem racist. So social psychologists have a different name for that phenomena, either racial anxiety or one of our colleagues calls it white stereotype threat. And what I would argue, and again, I know Song agrees with me on this because we were writing an article together, what I would argue is that kind of racial anxiety or white stereotype threat, that's deeply problematic too. So in fact, we don't do implicit bias trainings and just talk about implicit bias. We refuse to. We insist on talking about the multiple phenomena that are linked to race that cause those of us in positions of authority and power to treat people differently based upon race. Because for those middle school students who are getting insufficient critical feedback, that's a harm to them. And when I presented to a bunch of law firm partners 2 days ago and shared the Nexion study, one of the partners ran up to me afterward and said, well, I can't believe I would be someone who does the Nexion study because I don't give negative feedback to Black associates because I want to be helpful. And I said, and you know what? Undoubtedly those associates know that. And that's part of the reason that you have a retention problem. Because that's not what anyone's looking for. So first of all, and then just 2 quick points on the implicit bias. Another study that gives us really powerful, or actually a wealth of studies that give us very powerful information about implicit bias come from the health field. There have been lab studies where, again, there aren't any variables that sort of interrupt and sort of make it a messy decision. So there was a study in 2007 where residents were given a patient files and they were asked to diagnose and recommend treatment. I can see people nodding who know the study, the Green study from 2007. They were asked to diagnose and recommend treatment recommendations. A few weeks earlier, they'd taken the IAT. Those residents who had high, showing the bias against African Americans in the IAT were able to diagnose correctly across race. But when it came to treatment recommendations, they were significantly less likely to recommend the gold standard treatment of thrombolysis. A newer study, and this is a field study, showed doctors are less likely to give lesser degrees of pain medication to Black children who are getting appendectomies. Now, and this was this year. Now, the reason I agree with Roger, this doesn't mean that doctors are bigots. I don't think these doctors are waking up in the morning and saying, I don't think I want to give Black children proper pain medication. And I don't think I want to give Black patients proper heart care conditions. And in fact, that hypothesis was borne out by one cohort in that 2007 study who were told in little teeny print as part of their instructions that some people take race into account, or race can affect treatment recommendation decisions, and that group self-corrected. So we can overcome these biases. It's not that we're bigots, but the reason that I think Roger's solution, which is that we should just rip racial identifiers off of everything and we'll all be fine, is wrong, is because implicit bias isn't just evaluative and cognitive. It's relational. You can see when someone's biased by how they look at someone, how close they sit to them, how long their sentences are. Recent studies showing white doctors spending less time with Black patients at the end of life. Nonverbal communications. Now maybe, and again, I'm not going to torture Roger here, maybe some people would think these nonverbal communications are irrelevant, But these nonverbal communications tend to be the way that most of us interpret how people are responding to us. So if associates of color, for example, are whipsawed between, and I'll blame people like me, the happy liberals who won't give them any critical feedback, and those who are convinced that they can assess the work objectively, but are actually identifying twice as many typos, we're putting these associates in a complete bind. And there's actually a name for it, attributional ambiguity. How do you know what to do with feedback if you don't know if you're getting negative feedback because someone's reading it through a biased lens, and you're getting positive feedback because some happy liberal wants to say nice things to you? So there are answers to all of this, and frankly, the standards that the Supreme Court has set up don't require us to show that people are bigots. You know, even in the Ritchie case, which is obviously a case the liberals lost, it's clear that the standard is our actions taken are decisions made because of race. And what I would argue, and what I think the social science looked at broadly and looked at skeptically, shows is that there are a wealth of decisions that are made because of race. Not with animus necessarily, often not with animus. But if they're made because of race or because of gender and other contexts, they're still inconsistent with Title VII, with the Equal Protection Clause, and that's what we should be looking at. Good social science, not junk science, good science that helps us understand what the mechanisms are, what effects they're having, and then getting good people to try and prevent them from occurring so that people are treated fairly in all respects.
Rachel, before we get to song, trial lawyers would call this the rule of completeness. So I want to make sure I'm right about this. So the study you talked about with regard to the law firm memos, there was no corresponding IAT component to that study. I just want to make sure everybody knew that. Yeah, I'm confident there wasn't. Song? Anything you want to respond to?
Yes. But I think Rachel already said a lot of what I wanted to say, so I'll just make a few points. The first is I agree again with some of what Roger said. But I think most of Roger's points were a critique of the implicit association test. And that's why I really dislike it when we start doing these trainings where we only focus on that test, because that is only a tiny piece, actually, of the broad social psychology and all of the testing that demonstrates the existence of unconscious bias. And I'm going to talk about some of them in a moment before we end today. But that's just one point that I wanted to raise because I think it's important. The second point that I think is important is Mark Bennett mentioned at the beginning this book by Kahneman and Tversky called Thinking Fast and Slow. I highly recommend that book to all of you in this room. You can read that entire book, which is based on decades of work and by economists. And that book discusses the way that our brains work. The implicit or unconscious associations that we have are simply a small piece of a broader project of social psychologists about how we think and process information. I just want to give you one quick example. It has nothing to do with race, but which demonstrates how our brains work, which is why any critique of the IAT, I could say, sure, I'll give you the critiques of the implicit association test, but we have decades of studies that demonstrate how our brains work. There's a process called anchoring, which I think that most lawyers should know about if you don't know about it, right? So anchoring is a process where our brain creates an anchor when I throw out a number. So for instance, if I were to say, I think the population of Iowa City is 20,000 people. What do you think? The 20,000 that I've just given you serves as an anchor. So when you then estimate what the population of Iowa City is, you will only deviate from that 20,000 by a little, right? But you're not going to go, unless you know about anchoring, you're not going to go from 20,000 to 2 million, right? This is also important when you're going to buy a house, right? When you look at the estimate of a house price, that serves as an anchor, and then you negotiate from that price unless you are aware of anchors. So if you're negotiating with people in a contract dispute, you want to say the first number, right? Because that will serve as an anchor. So again, this is an unconscious process. It's just the way our brains work. Unconscious racial associations are simply part of that. And we learn these associations by growing up in this culture, so I agree with Roger, right? A lot of what the implicit association is testing is our knowledge of stereotypes, both positive and negative. The issue is they can have some effects. So that was point one. The second point, I do want to talk about implicit white favoritism. And that's because one of the points that Roger made is often the implicit association test means that I'm calling myself a bigot and I'm calling all of you a bigot. I don't believe I'm a bigot. And I believe that most people today in this country are consciously and genuinely egalitarian. But often, racial disparities are not caused by out-group derogation. It's not caused by the fact that I hate people of color, right? Or I hate people who are white, because I could say that, right, if I'm a bigot. But most of it, or much of it, some social psychologists think, are also caused by in-group favoritism, more favorably viewing people of one's own in-group, and as a result, you treat them more favorably without even necessarily realizing it. There have been tests of what people have called, like Justin Levinson and Robert Smith, implicit white favoritism. So let me just, do I have time,
Yep.
Mark, to talk about a couple studies of implicit white favoritism, and let me give you a definition of it. So what it means is we unconsciously associate black men, especially black men, with criminality and other negative traits. You know what those traits are because you know what the stereotypes are. The flip side is we associate whites with innocence and other positive associations. And again, Roger can say, who cares, right? It just shows us what we know. The problem is there have been studies now that demonstrate the negative effects, the ways in which implicit white favoritism can cause racial disparity. So when I talk about implicit white favoritism, what I'm saying is that white men are disassociated from crime, and implicit white favoritism is not race neutral. Let me share two studies with you. There was one study done at Stanford where the social psychologist Jennifer Eberhardt showed groups of subjects either a black face, a white face, or no face at all. This was done so quickly, it's called subliminal priming, so quickly that you weren't even aware, if you were the subject, that you'd seen any faces at all. I'm showing you the faces, but these aren't from the actual study, actually. But they would be flashed on a computer screen. The purpose of doing that is to trigger all of the unconscious associations that you might have when you see a black face, a white face, or no face at all. Okay, so after these were flashed, but you didn't know that you'd seen them, then you were shown a photo, a fuzzy frame, and you either saw a crime-relevant object or a crime-irrelevant object. The goal for you is to stop the frames from proceeding when you were able to identify the object. And what the social psychologists wanted to know is how many frames would it take for you to be able to identify the object, and would the photo matter? Okay. So you can see on the bottom of the screen, the left-hand side is flashing white faces. The middle is not seeing faces at all. That's the race-neutral, color-blind group. And then on the right, it's flashing black faces. So on the left-hand side, the vertical line is how many frames it took. When you saw no faces, the race-neutral, color-blind, right, position, it took about 23 frames to notice the weapon. When you saw or crime irrelevant, sorry, to notice the iron, let's say, right? And it didn't matter whether it was white faces, black faces, or no faces at all. These differences are statistically insignificant. It took about 23 frames to notice and identify the crime irrelevant object. When you saw no faces, the race-neutral condition, as you would expect, same number of frames, right? Regardless of whether it was a crime-relevant or crime-irrelevant object, it didn't matter. But notice, when you flashed the black face, it took significantly fewer frames to recognize the weapon, because blacks are associated with criminality in our unconscious minds. But when you saw the white face, it's not race-neutral. It took much longer. This is why I, as a liberal person, which I embrace, do not like color blindness, right? Do not like objective criteria to the extent whatever objective means. That's something I always tell my students. Tell me what you mean when you say objective and reasonable. Really what you're saying is, this is what I think is the right thing, right? There's no agnostic definition of what's reasonable. It depends on you. And so if we were to be race neutral, you can see from implicit white favoritism that some whites would be treated better. It is just not race neutral. Let me talk about one more study if I can. This is implicit white I won't talk about the memory test, but I will tell you very quickly, because it's similar to the resume study. In jury studies, when the only difference between the defendant was the name, whether or not that defendant was named William to trigger whiteness, or Tyrone to make people think the defendant was black, the jurors, after being distracted for about 15 minutes, came back and they were asked questions about the facts in a criminal case. They recalled more aggressive facts when the defendant was named Tyrone. They forgot more when the defendant was named William, and which we might not think of as problematic anyway, because at least with the black defendant, they remembered more, though you can see the disparities. They made up more aggressive facts when it came to the black defendant. And I'm not saying that these jurors were doing this on purpose. No, what I'm saying is we associate blacks with criminality and whites with innocence. It is more difficult to see criminality. There's a final study that I just wanted to quickly talk about, but I don't want to take up all the time, so let me just show you one thing. This is another jury study. They were shown photos of a robbery that took place at a convenience store, shown evidence from the robbery, but the important pieces of evidence were this. Some subjects saw a white forearm, and some subjects saw the dark forearm of the alleged perpetrator. And then, because this was, again, meant to trigger our unconscious associations. Again, another way of testing our unconscious associations that's unrelated to the implicit association test. Then they were given a bunch of evidence, ambiguous as to guilt or innocence, right? It's irrelevant, these pieces of evidence, whether or not that defendant was guilty or innocent. What they found is, when you saw the dark-skinned perpetrator, you were more likely to think the defendant was guilty and more likely to view these pieces of evidence as being probative of guilt. When you saw the white-skinned forearm, you were more likely to think that the defendant was innocent, and you were more likely to believe that these pieces of evidence were not probative of guilt, but rather probative of innocence. And so these are the ways in which implicit white favoritism can also help. And the final thing I'll say in terms of color blindness, because I know that many people like to believe that we live in a colorblind world and don't want to consider race in any possible way. With some of these juror studies, when race was not made salient, black defendants were treated worse than white defendants in identical cases. But when race was made salient, those differences disappeared, and black and white defendants were treated equally in some of these studies. So that's the last thing I say.
I just want one follow-up comment on the last study you talked about to give you an example of how the jurors in the study interpreted ambiguous evidence in a racially discriminatory way. They were told that the defendant was right-handed, but in the photo they saw, both with the black arm and the white arm, the person was carrying the weapon in their left hand. When the jurors were deliberating about what they thought was the black defendant, they thought he intentionally switched hands to avoid detection. But then with regard to the white defendant, that never came up. It was just an ambiguous piece of evidence that was never discussed. Roger, we haven't picked on you for a while. You're outgunned 3-1 here. When I was looking at your website, I read that one of the missions of the Center for Equal Opportunity is to promote colorblind society. How do you think implicit bias fits in with your mission?
Well, as I said at the outset, I don't deny that there is such a thing as unconscious racism. I don't deny that there's such a thing as conscious racism. There is. And by the way, when I talked about, bigotry, I'm using that as maybe this isn't the dictionary definition, but I'm assuming a bigot is somebody who treats people differently on the basis of race or ethnicity, whether they intend to or not. And I think that that's wrong. I think that that's generally illegal, and I think that it should be. And I don't think that anybody. This is a charge that's frequently made that people who think that who talk about colorblindness are just silly because we don't live in a colorblind society. Well, I agree that we don't live in a colorblind society. I mean, colorblindness is a normative ideal, not a description, of the way things are. To the extent that there is unconscious or conscious bias out there, I'm against it, and I'm all in favor of trying to get rid of it. My point is, and I think there's a lot of agreement on this, that there are good and bad ways to identify it, and some social science that purports to identify unconscious bias doesn't do a very good job. I think that, as I said, even when I think that even to the extent that it is identified, it doesn't always translate into actual discrimination. We're all aware that we have, our brain is working. It has all kinds of stuff is going on out there. But we can, we overcome irrationality all the time, in what we do. And if you are aware that this is a problem, that I might not be treating everybody equally, you redouble your efforts to do that. And there are a lot of incentives out there that our society has, for that. I mean, for starters, it's illegal. If you're hiring people, it's bad for the bottom line if you hire people who aren't the best for the job because of your bigotry or your bias. It's socially bad to. I mean, I'm trying to think what the phrase is. It's this is something that our society condemns by and large. That we're not supposed to treat people differently because of race and ethnicity. I mean, there are all kinds of incentives out there for people not to engage in this discrimination, and I'm in favor of that. I think that the ideal of treating people without regard to race, ethnicity, sex, et cetera, remains the ideal of the Center for Equal Opportunity, and I'm not ashamed of that. I would be, interested if I could. I mean, and
could I turn to Rachel?
Sure,
I'll try
sure.
and come back to you for a minute. Rachel, sometimes studies indicate that there's a correlation between an IAT score and a discriminatory decision, but sometimes not. For example, in the study that Justin Levinson and I recently wrote up, where we studied judges from around the country, state court judges and federal court judges, in a sentencing of a white-collar defendant, some of the judges got a Caucasian, a Christian defendant, a third of the judges got an Asian defendant, and a third of the judges got a Jewish defendant. Judges across the board, state and federal, had higher implicit biases than members of the public with regard to those groups, which is consistent with Ruklinski's study. But they were able to control the implicit bias in terms of the length of the sentence with regard to the Asian, but not with regard to the Jew. And there are other studies that indicate sometimes there's a correlation, sometimes there isn't. I haven't really found a consistent theory as to why that is. Do you have one?
So I think that the one explanation for the particular study you just described could actually be sort of the obverse of Roger's thought that the goal should be to act as though we can be colorblind or sort of blind to these identity differences so that we then can be. Because what I would think, and I'm curious to hear what you and Justin concluded, is that the judges were probably more conscious of the need to be careful when it came to the, was it a Muslim defendant? Asian defendant, than they were the Jewish defendant, because the kind of cognizance of Jewish or Christian bias probably wasn't uppermost in their minds. And so I think there's been quite a bit of, there's been studies of judges have found that because judges are aware of the need to be objective with respect to identity characteristics, they're generally fairly good at responding to scenarios without bias, in some sense, unless they're not aware that that's being tested. And of course, when judges are actually on the bench, and I do a lot of work with judges, and judges are beginning to become very concerned, frankly, about how their biases may be affecting their decisions, because they hear these presentations and they start to think about, you know, the different concepts that Song described, the pro-white favoritism, for example. I've talked to state judges who said, and they kind of looked down and thought, so the suburban woman who came in with a DUI after coming home from a cocktail party, who I didn't sentence to the traditional DUI and found some way to get her home, that's what that was. Or again, the sort of white college kid who had a small amount of cocaine, who I didn't. They start thinking about the decisions that they've made. That again, obviously we can talk about the Stanford rape case, but just really quickly, I think what's in thinking about correlations, as we discussed at the outset, it's never going to be possible for something like an IAT. It's not sophisticated enough to prove correlation or causation in an individual decision. But here's so Jerry Kong did this work for us, so I will give him complete credit. So the correlation level that's generally found in the most recent meta-analysis for IAT bias is 0.15. What Jerry did, which was great, is, and I think with Anthony Greenwald, is shared the correlation with the aspirin and reduced risk of death by heart attack, which is 0.02, chemotherapy surviving breast cancer, 0.03, ever smoking and subsequent lung cancer in the next 25 years, 0.08, alcohol use and premature birth, 0.09, and low-level lead exposure and reduced IQ for children, 0.12. All of those, whether you're a statistician or not, are clearly below the 0.15. So the point is, these are small effect size. The correlation is not perfect by any stretch, but there are all sorts of other areas. I would sort of challenge any of us to say, okay, since the low-level lead exposure and reduced childhood IQ is only 0.12, I'm okay with having lead in my house with my 2-year-old. That's okay with me. None of us are going to do that. So I think the point is the IAT, though, again, we all have some questions about it. We're all we all think it's important that there are other measures in addition to the IAT. But at the same time, the IAT has some serious juice if it can be seen as actually more heavily correlated with biased behavior than all these other areas that we take very seriously in our lives.
And it's being improved. I mean, they
improved
upgraded
all
the
time.
algorithm.
Yes.
So
again, I think while I see part of my role here in expanding the kinds of social science phenomena we think are important, because I think the implicit bias has kind of a simplicity and a resonance, and by virtue of having this cool little computer test that you can use, at Harvard, it has gotten sort of a lot of the attention in thinking about the role that race plays in our unconscious decision making. But if we look more carefully at social science, as I said earlier, there are these other phenomena that are equally important. And again, the way in which I do agree with Roger, although I'm not sure he agrees with me, is that we're not actually doing the world too much of a favor if we make it seem as though we're calling everyone bigots. I actually think that's deeply problematic, because it, again, does create this anxiety that people feel, and it primes the anxiety that whites often feel about intergroup contact. And it turns out when we're worried, we white people are worried about being seen as biased, we tend to avoid intergroup contact. We just avoid it altogether. If it's confirmed to us, recent study came out on this, Song and I are very excited about this, if we're aware of racial anxiety as an issue, if we're aware that our concern about seeming biased may result in our feeling anxious, and we're assured that if we have these interactions and we engage peer-to-peer with people, that anxiety will diminish, we actually have better interactions, so we don't confirm the person who we're interacting with, who may well have her own anxiety that this white person is going to act weird toward me, which we sometimes do. And so the whole thing goes better, and it becomes a positive cycle, and the racial anxiety is reduced. So this is the focus on who's a bigot and who's not is really very much outside the project of the work that we're all doing. I think we're probably, where my disagreement with Roger is most profound is in order to figure out where again, you obviously agree that people should not be behaving differently toward people because of race or other identity characteristics. But let's say we have a lawsuit, or let's say we have a workplace, or let's say we have a healthcare institution or a police department, and we're concerned about these issues. If people are voluntarily willing to engage and try and reduce the behavior, great. That's actually what a lot of what we do. But if they're not and there's a lawsuit, it seems to me, because in general, most white people do think that we're pretty post-racial, and most white people do think the world is generally fair. So when hearing the information that may lead one to conclude that bias helps to explain some of the outcomes, we're going to explain it away. We're going to explain it away the same way that we explained away the left-handed or the right-handed person with the gun. If people have this social science explained to them by an expert in a lawsuit, I think that gives people the information that they need to be able to make a reasoned assessment of whether or not what's happening in a particular institution may be a result of race or not. So I think that probably is where Roger and I would disagree the most profoundly, because if people don't have this information that everyone in this room, it sounds like this is a pretty advanced audience already, half of you, more than half of you had already taken the IIT, but if most people don't have that information, it's very easy to hear ambiguous, sort of explanations for conduct and to assume them away. Because we want to think well of people. And what we're, I think, able to do is we can still think people want to be good, want to be good, want to be fair, want to be non-racist. And we can hold on to that view of them, but still say there's a ton of research to suggest that even these well-intentioned people, ourselves included, may be engaged in behavior that really, truly is because of race, and therefore has to be addressed as such.
But you would agree that...
Sure.
Time is really short. And I'm sorry, I've been a little frustrated because I accept as pretty uncontroversial your general assertions about the existence of implicit or unconscious bias. I think that's just human nature. What I want to hear is, what do you want the law to do about this? What does this give us that we don't have with, say, disparate treatment or disparate impact? Do you want to see more Brandeis briefs using this kind of evidence? Do you relate it to affirmative action? Tell us what you want the law to do with this.
And in the course of answering that, I mean, the point that I was going to make is, to what extent should this evidence be required to go through Daubert-type, analysis, to make sure that it actually, or Daubert, however it's pronounced, to make sure that it actually is reputable, good science.
I mean, again, happy to hear from others, but my answer to your question is absolutely yes. More Brandeis briefs, more expert testimony available, more context in lawsuits for people to be able to make reasoned decisions, for judges and juries to be able to make reasoned decisions, to understand the context of conduct in a way that I think it would be impossible otherwise to do. So that would be a robust yes to your question.
I'll just give you one example for judges. About 15 years ago, in pre-sentence reports, which every judge gets before they sentence somebody, there was a big movement to put a picture of the defendant in the pre-sentence report. And everybody thought that was a good idea, including me, until I started learning about implicit bias. So I no longer, and haven't for 6 or 7 years now, I don't receive a picture of the defendant, and I have all the racial identification information removed from the pre-sentence report. It has to go in after the sentence, because it has to be reported to the administrative office. But that photograph, particularly with strong Afrocentric features, the study shows, is a huge racial prime, and the studies indicate that people with strong Afrocentric features, even white people, get longer sentences. It's not the race as much as the Afrocentric features, interestingly enough. So there are a number of things judges can do to try and remove some of these triggers that trigger your implicit biases, and then just being aware of them is very helpful too.
And the final thing I want to say in terms of doctrine, like Supreme Court doctrine, a lot of it is extremely problematic and makes it difficult, right? So the 14th Amendment often, for instance, just recognizes conscious and intentional racism and not these more unconscious types, right? And so
Although I would argue based on Ritchie, because of race, we can actually interpret
you
it
could,
more
you're,
capaciously.
right, okay, so you're,
Yeah, I'm not sure about that either. I mean,
Okay,
it seems to
great.
me that if you actually are treating people differently because of race, whether it's conscious
fantastic.
or unconscious.
Well, then that's great. I love that, then that's great, because the court has not taken that view, but I would love them.
Well, I'm not sure.
Let's
that's
go to
exactly
another-
the view.
let's go to
Okay,
another question.
Can I add one thing
Okay,
though?
go ahead.
But that's the reason why I focus more on people like Judge Bennett and others to try to create institutional and systemic changes in police departments, in courtrooms. So for instance, jury orientation videos that explain to jurors the impact of implicit associations on their judgments. That's where I focus a lot of the energy versus on the actual doctrine itself.
Absolutely, of course it should be subject to Daubert,
Yeah.
but I think that, again, I think if it were subject to a fair Daubert analysis, it was clear what the answer would be.
Yep.
I'm not sure that the track record has been that good, actually, for
There have
this.
been a few cases that's come in recently, but yeah, okay, I think we have a line of people who are.
Go ahead.
Judge Bennett, you started mentioning the Williams decision the other day.
Yes.
In the Supreme Court. I think even the dissenters said it would be better if the judge had recused himself. I mean, he had a life or death decision, and then he reviewed the case. What keeps judges from recognizing not only their own bias, but the appearance of bias that is a reasonable suspicion of partiality? What is it in the mental processes that you've explored that keeps them from doing the right thing?
Well, I think it comes back to this blind spot bias, which I am studying. I think it's easy to see why another judge should recuse themselves and much harder to see why you should.
Well, but they still excuse each other more than they don't.
Well, you know, one solution, I think, is that maybe judges ought not to. Fortunately, I've only had one recusal motion in 22 years. But judges probably ought not to rule on their own recusal motions, and that's true in a number of states. So that might be one solution.
I have two related questions. Most of the discussion was binary, it was black and white. And so how much of this research has focused on other ethnicities or backgrounds? And secondly, how much does the research vary by culture? So is there variation within the United States and the United States versus Europe versus Asia and other parts of the world?
So most of the, as you can imagine in our culture, most of the studies have focused, unfortunately in our view, on the black-white binary. There are more recently studies that have broadened the frame beyond that. So Rachel has already talked about some of the studies with regard to Latinos. There are studies with regard to Asians. We didn't get to talk about stereotype threat, but in that field too, there have been many studies dealing with gender, dealing with Asians, and dealing with Latinos and the way that stereotype threat and racial anxiety can influence behaviors. Does it depend on culture, and do other countries have similar dynamics? Yes, but it might not necessarily be the white, black in the way that we understand it here, right? So there's a study with employment, for instance, in, where was it? Netherlands, that tested their cultural construct, their views of race, and we found, the researchers there also found similar results in terms of the subordinated group within their society is also found, the population also has implicit biases that view them negatively.
Okay, I just wanted to mention one study that I'm currently doing with regard to implicit gender bias in the award of civil damages, particularly emotional distress damages. And Justin Levinson and I have a study going on now with judges and jurors and lawyers in the evaluation of cases where damages are awarded to take a look at, and everybody's taken a customized IAT and take a look at if there's a difference in the award of damages in civil cases based on gender. Our time is up. Thank you all very much, and thank our panelists.